Hi, everybody. I'd like to introduce Daron Acemoglu from MIT. Daron studies, for this talk, labor economics and how automation is impacting labor, as well as how societies wax and wane, succeed and fail, which is another really awesome area of his work that you should also follow up on. So welcome, Daron.
Thank you, Greg. It's my pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about a topic that's familiar to most of you, but probably giving an interpretation that is somewhat different from the model belief in Google or in this room. So hopefully we'll have opportunity to talk about the pros and cons of my interpretation and have an exchange of ideas. But let me just show some facts first. There has been a huge shift against labor throughout the industrialized nation, especially in the US. So for example, in this figure, you see that the aggregate labor share in the US has declined by about 6-7 percentage points since 2000. And if you do composition adjusted for the sectoral composition, since there are big differences across sectors in the labor share, the decline is actually larger, about 9 percentage points. This has been the focus of a lot of research, and there are many ideas, but what I'm going to argue is that this is related to what Pasquale Restrepo and I call the task content of production, how you organize production, and in particular driven by automation and perhaps excessive automation. And I will also interpret that AI may be the next act in this stream of automation technologies, and why we are using AI in this way. I'll make some conjectures on that. This shift against labor, even if you don't care about aggregate labor shares, has huge consequences. I think probably now more people are aware than they were, say, 10, 15 years ago, that A, wage inequality has increased tremendously in the US, and B, that this has really some pernicious effects on society, on people feeling alienated, discontented, and turning to lots of different ways in order to have their discontent felt. But the facts for wage inequality are really fascinating if you haven't seen them before. Here I'm showing you one way of understanding these facts by plotting the evolution of real earnings, everything normalized to zero so that you can see them more easily, from 1963 onwards for 10 demographic groups distinguished by education, all the way from postgraduate degree to no high school degree at the bottom, and men and women. So the remarkable thing, which was also true in the 1950s, though not in this figure, you need to use other data sources for that, that in the 1960s and early 70s, growth was remarkably shared. So real wages for all of these 10 education and demographic groups increased in tandem. They increased faster than 2% a year in real terms. And it was really remarkable. So you see that most of these lines are on top of each other. And then from 1980 onwards, or late 1970s onwards, you see three interconnected changes. First, you see a big fanning out. There's a big gap between the top and the bottom here, between the top and the bottom here. Second, even when you look at this light blue curve for men, which is workers with college degree but no postgraduate degree, there's essentially no meaningful wage growth from the mid-70s onwards. This is also true for median wages in the distribution. So the average American, the middle class, or close to the upper middle class, isn't really not benefited much. And combining the first two, actually those at the bottom, those with no high school degree, or community college or associate degrees, have seen quite significant declines in their real wages. This is, for example, the red curve is really staggering decline in real wages. So if you are a high school dropout man today, you are almost surely earning quite a bit less than your father did. And the same is true for women, although women have caught up with men. So the college graduate women, for example, have some wage growth, and high school graduate women are sort of stable. This is not just a US phenomenon, though there are some aspects of it that are specific to the US. First of all, US started in the 1980s more unequal than pretty much every other country, but in all of these developed nations, industrialized nations, you have an increase in inequality, except for Greece. And the US one is as large as any one of the other ones. Sweden, New Zealand, and Germany are also pretty large. But what's really remarkable about the US, which is something that interacts with automation, as I will argue, is that because of lack of minimum wages, union wage bargaining, and social norms protecting low-wage workers, these changes have not just meant higher inequality, but also lower earnings at the bottom. The other defining character of these changes that have really hit the middle class, as you can see here, is also common across countries, is that they have been related to automation in some quite apparent ways, and have also again had their main burden felt on the middle classes. So one way of seeing that is to distinguish between different parts of the occupational distribution separated by how high or high skilled different occupations are. It doesn't matter whether you use wages or skills. And here, these are separated into bottom tercile, top tercile, and middle tercile. So the middle tercile is essentially the backbone of the middle class in the US. It includes production workers, operators, clerical workers, back office workers, sales workers. And you see that there has been a huge decline in the fraction of jobs in the middle tercile since early 1990s, replaced by some lower wage occupations, protection services, food preparation, home care, etc. And some higher ones, not surprising because US workforce has become much more educated. But again, the big story is not that there are more engineers and technicians. There is a little bit more. It's this red one here. And the same thing, as you can see, is true for all OECD economies. So middle class has been hammered in different ways in all of these countries. In some of them, it has not translated into lower wages, for example, in France, but it has led to a huge decline in employment for the affected groups. So how do we make sense of this? Well, the standard economist way of making sense of it is to posit a production function and think of technology as making factors more productive, factor augmenting. So this is the way that you can, for example, summarize it. Say, for example, output in a sector or in the economy, GDP, is produced out of a production function that takes labor and capital. Again, high level, you can do skilled labor, unskilled labor, other distinctions. But the most important thing is these blue terms. Technology makes labor and capital more productive. This way of doing it, which is what we all learned in graduate school, it was also what's extensively studied, for example, in my own textbook, both for graduate students and undergraduate students, has really colored the way that economists think about the problem. And through the economists, perhaps it has even impacted or went along already pre-existing conceptions that many people in Silicon Valley and in policy positions would have as well, which is that technology is going to be the tide that's going to lift all boats. And that makes a lot of sense, because if technology is making labor and capital more productive, it might have some distributional effects. Some people may benefit more than others. Google may benefit, Yahoo may lose out. But at the end, in the aggregate, it's going to make things better. And in fact, that's one prediction of this view, which is so second nature to economists, and again, I think to a lot of tech people, that technology is a good thing. That it might have some distributional consequences you may have to deal with, but it's going to benefit people by and large. Now, let's see whether that's actually correct. The evidence I suggested at least raises some questions whether that's true or not. But there's also another problem with this way of approaching the effects of technology. First of all, there's no microstructure here that really captures what's going on. Ever since the British Industrial Revolution, which was about, so it started with spinning and weaving machines replacing skilled artisans, an important part of technology is about mechanization or automation. It's substituting capital for labor. That really doesn't happen in a direct way here. It may happen indirectly because technological change may increase the productivity of capital or labor, and that might lead to some reallocation, but it's sort of a minor thing. So therefore, this framework is really not super useful for thinking about, all of the various waves of technological changes that have been defining for industrialized nations over the last 250 years. Spinning, weaving, industrial revolution, I mentioned already, horse-powered reapers, harvesters, threshing machines in agriculture, later in tractors, machine tools replacing labor-intensive artisanal techniques, industrial robotics more lately, but not just industrial robotics, but whole range of dedicated machinery specialized in welding, machining, assembly, packaging that really reduce labor requirements quite significantly by having machines perform these tasks, and more importantly related to the new tech sectors, software's automated routine tasks, first by white-collar workers, and then later with AI, managerial, and other specialized skills as well. Now, in addition to being hard to map to the above production function, as I'm going to explain in the next few slides, there is no necessity, in my opinion, that these things should really act like the tide that lifts all boats. And in fact, I'll try to provide an analysis of why that is the case in a second. But also, just as a marker, let's also remember that, again, not so easy to think about it with a reduced form function like this, but quite important for thinking about how technology has impacted labor, wages, employment, industrial structure, middle classes, etc. over the last 100 years are new tasks. So if you think about all of the people you know and think about what is it that they do at work, I would venture a guess that for most of you, 50% of your friends do things that did not exist 50 years ago, and another 40% of your friends do things that existed 40 years, 50 years ago, but what they do at work is very different than 50 years ago. So professors existed 100 years ago, but what I do today is so different in terms of tasks relative to what a professor did in the 1960s or 1950s. So that is related to the introduction of new tasks, which I'm going to come back to as well. So only one equation I'm going to share with you, and the details of the equation don't matter, but here is just adding some specificity for an alternative, and I would argue more fruitful way of thinking about how technology impacts labor, society, productivity, wages, and so on. Start thinking in terms of tasks. Imagine that output is a combination of a range of tasks. Say, for example, if you want to produce a piece of garment, you need to do the spinning, weaving, carding, drawing, design, and then processing, coloring, transport, retail, wholesale. All of these tasks need to be completed for a piece of garment to be delivered to a consumer. So this YZ is the task services. They are combined in some way. For example, all tasks need to be performed, but some of them may be performed worse than others, and that will have some impact. That's going to be guided by this sigma parameter, the elasticity of substitution. And the range of tasks goes from n-1 to n. The key is this equation here. It says that tasks can be produced either using capital or labor. Each task has different productivities for capital and labor. So gamma LZ and gamma KZ are the productivity of different factors in task Z. And actually, my office is freezing, so I'm going to put my jacket on 1 second. And then I've also allowed these factor augmenting terms AL and AK if you want them for generality, but the really big action is this specific comparative advantage that different factors of production, labor, skilled labor, unskilled labor, capital would have in different tasks. And here, for simplicity, let me assume that tasks below some threshold I are feasible to automate. So we know how to automate, and we may decide not to. Amazon knows how to automate many different aspects of warehouse work, but they decided not to automate all of them because of cost issues. And then these I to N are technologically infeasible to automate. And then this N here, as we'll see, corresponds to new tasks. So this sort of expands what labor can do. Okay, so here is a visual way of thinking about this. So this blue curve here is the cost of production of various different tasks, the wage divided by the productivity of labor in those tasks. This is the rental, the user cost of capital divided by the productivity of capital. And then the firm would choose the lower envelope here, subject to, of course, only tasks below I can be automated. So now in this figure, let me try to illustrate what the standard way of thinking of technology does. So for example, an increase in AL would shift this curve down here. So there are two problems with this picture, which is what I said in 2 slides ago, but now you can see it from a different light. First, I don't know of any technology in the history of technologies that really increases the productivity of labor uniformly in all tasks. A hammer makes you much better at hammering a nail, but it doesn't make you a better cook, a better programmer, a better driver, etc. So most technologies are like hammers. But more importantly, you see an implicit thing that we sort of both here, that when you have a technological change, it increases productivity by a huge amount because all tasks are becoming more productive when used with labor. Same thing with capital. All tasks here are becoming more productive with capital. So the integral here is a huge number, and that's going to matter. Here is alternatively what automation looks like. Automation doesn't make you more productive in what you were doing already with existing tasks, but it switches tasks, for example, by extending what was feasible to automate. So the I shifts from I to I prime. You can already see in this picture at a high level without, and you don't need to have a PhD in economics, although a PhD in economics always helps. There's going to be two very distinct effects from automation. One is a direct impact. Automation takes over all of these tasks. So workers are going to get displaced from these tasks. That's going to have some consequences. Second, the productivity effect now, instead of being by this huge rectangle, is given by a triangle. And in fact, you can make that triangle as little as possible if you want, because this orange line could have been actually much closer to the blue line, in which case you would have ended up with a tiny triangle. So put differently, productivity effects of automation are very contingent. They depend on what type of automation, whether you really found a way of substituting capital for tasks that were already not so well performed by labor and were expensive with labor, or whether you're actually substituting capital for labor for things that labor was pretty good at. So in fact, that's going to be relevant. I'll come back to this. I will argue that most of AI to date actually substitute for labor in things that labor is very good at. Now, new tasks are completely different. It's actually extending this thing, so it might have very different organizational, reinstatement, and productivity effects, and I'll come back to that. All right, I'm going to skip this picture, this slide. Other than saying that this is just more for the economists, that if you actually work out the labor share, you will see that what I'm talking about, this task content in these orange terms, is completely separable from the blue terms. So almost everything you've learned in textbooks and most of past research until about 10 years ago was these blue terms. But what I'm talking about is a separate thing, is these orange terms, which is taken as given in the standard accounts. So what about labor demand? So it's actually amplifying what I try to argue about the importance of thinking about labor demand. So labor demand you can proxy what it is as the wage bill. How much, say, private businesses in the US are paying to labor. And that is by definition output times labor share. So that's why labor share really matters. That's why I started from the labor share. And then if you say, what's the effect of automation on labor demand? It's very easy. It's given by a productivity effect, this blue area, and a displacement effect. It's this change in this gamma function, or directly this here area. The displacement effect is always negative. The productivity effect is always positive. What that implies is that there is no guarantee, in contrast to the standard way that many tech people and many economists used to think about this, that technology is good for labor ultimately. There is no such necessity. If this triangle is small and the displacement is large, labor is going to displace much more than improve the opportunities for labor, and labor is going to get hammered. In fact, if really you are doing great technological change, that green area is going to be great, bigger, brilliant technologies. So you might have large displacement effect, but that's going to be counterbalanced by large productivity gains. But so-so technologies, which are technologies where firms are adopting, they might improve their costs and increase their profits a little bit, but not so great, especially when you're substituting capital for things that humans were already good at, or for things in which algorithms and capitals are not so good at. Then you're going to get large displacement effects and tiny productivity effects, and wages are going to fall. Now, if the past had a lot of automation, as I argued, and nothing else, then there's a problem. Because this combination of productivity effect and displacement effect already means that labor share will always fall. One way of seeing that is if you shut down the displacement effect, the productivity effect would mean proportionate increase in labor earnings as output, so which means labor share constant. But as soon as you add the displacement effect, labor share always falls. So that's one telltale sign of automation, labor share falling. That's almost always the case. Automation reduces the labor share. But in the data, we don't see the labor share falling all the time. Why not? Well, the answer that Pasquale and I give is that it's because of new tasks. We continuously create new tasks as well, and these new tasks reinstate labor into the production process in a central way. Doing the same algebra, but skipping the details, now the effects of new tasks is composed of a productivity effect, which is actually generally bigger than a triangle. So new tasks are for GDP are better, plus really good for labor, because in addition to the productivity effect, now you get a reinstatement effect that's positive. So it's good for, always good for labor. So reinstatement effect, new tasks are fantastic for labor. Does this make any sense? Well, let me show you two layers of evidence to argue at least that this is not just a figment of our imagination. First of all, in the US, if you were to look at the recent period, what correlates with industry declines in labor share, various measures of automation are chief factors. So here, for example, I'm showing you how industry labor shares and robotics adoption has gone. The diamonds are manufacturing, circles are non-manufacturing industries. A lot of employment is here, but robotics is mostly relevant for manufacturing, and you see a very strong negative relationship. The more robotics that you adopt, the lower is the labor share. More broadly, if you look at routine tasks that got automated in an industry, now you see all the non-manufacturing, and you see that there is a very strong relationship there as well, both in manufacturing and non-manufacturing, an alternative way of thinking of automation. And here I'm showing you zeroing in on a machine tool and related machining industries, much more detailed level, and looking at other measures of automation, and you see the same thing. A statistically significant negative relationship between automation at this very narrow industry level and the labor share. What about new tasks? New tasks are harder to measure, but various different ways in which Pasquale Restrepo and I have measured them. For example, new activities at the occupation level or industry level, or diversity of occupations changing at the industry level. They are all associated with positive changes in labor share or positive changes in the task content of production. But this is very aggregative, not so close to causal. So let me do a case study, an example, the effects of robots and jobs. So robots have been a transformative technology for US manufacturing. The evidence from our work and others' work shows that, in places where you had more robot adoption, that has been quite significant increases in productivity. So if you again have a view that productivity increases are going to somehow translate into higher demand for labor, higher wages, higher employment, this is a test case for that. Relative to lots of software and AI, for which I think the evidence of great productivity gains are scant, robots, we really have good evidence of productivity gain. But I'm going to show you that because displacement is so important, even in that case, you are not going to see much of a positive effect on labor. So to do that, let's look at the local labor market and construct an exposure to robots, which is how much the frontier of robotics technology is advancing in an industry, robot penetration of that industry, and then how important that industry is in that local area. So indeed, the more exposed a local labor market is to robotics, the more robotics activity you have. For example, local robotics integrators who are working on robot integration and programming at the local level. So what is the effect of this on employment? A huge negative. I mean, not huge at the aggregate level, because we're talking about 10% of the workforce, but about 5 jobs lost per robots introduced. This is showcased but not driven by the industrial heartland of the United States. Places like Detroit, Lansing, Defiance, Lorain City, and so on. So these are places where car industry, electronics, metalworks, and so on have been automated most rapidly. But this is not driven by that, so that's why I put 2 curves here. If you cut out all of these places that are the industrial heartland here and look at this cloud of points, the slope of the line is identical. It's given by the dashed line instead of the solid one. And not just lower employment, but significantly lower wages. So composition adjusted wages fall even more steeply. Again, a telltale sign of lower labor demand. So at least in this case of robots, labor is not benefiting while firms are benefiting. Again, not an unusual pattern for automation technologies in general. And indeed, what's driving this is substitution of machines for workers. So if you look at where the employment declines are coming from, it's not coming from personal services or professional jobs, certainly not finance, managerial support, or etc. It's coming from routine manual occupations and operators, assemblymen, inspectors, and production workers. These are exactly the jobs in which robots are substituting and displacing workers. Now, I talked about wages and employment, and I don't have time to talk about this, unfortunately, but recent work with Pasquale Restrepo also finds that automation is responsible for the bulk of the changes in inequality. Those 2 pictures that I showed at the beginning, about 60 to 70% of the changes in the US wage structure are related to automation. So precisely the groups that lose out and see those wage declines or stagnant wages while others benefit are exactly those which have seen automation of the tasks in which they specialized. And just a summary of this is the task displacement at the group level for 500 demographic groups. This is the changes in their hourly real wages, the sort of more detailed version of those 2 figures. So 1980 to 2016. Different colors correspond to the different education groups I showed you. It's a huge positive negative relationship. And in fact, you see that the groups high school dropout are exactly those that have seen most of the tasks in which they specialize being automated. And the groups that have benefited, like the postgraduates, are the ones that did not suffer any task displacement. Okay. All right, what about AI? Almost everything I talked about predates AI. In fact, I stopped the data in 2016. 2016, according to recent work that I have with Joe Hazel, Pascual Restrepo, and David Otter, is exactly the date where you see AI technologies diffusion take off. So this is based on hiring of people such as yourselves, or many of you, machine learning, data science, and other AI specialists on burning glass. You see a huge increase in narrow AI also, as well as broad AI, but I trust the narrow AI numbers more. And it's in many sectors, not all sectors, but in many sectors. But what do we see in terms of its consequences? That's what the topic of that paper is, and I'm not going to have time to go into it. But depending on whatever, regardless of what measure you use, you see that the adoption of AI technologies and hiring of AI personnel concentrates in establishments that have more tasks that are replaceable by AI. It's the fourth quartile, to some degree, the third quartile that drives the growth. These are the quartiles of the establishments in terms of their task distribution, the green and the blue. And this is regardless of which measure of how we classify tasks. And then if you look at employment, you see exactly the opposite pattern. Those establishments that are hiring more in AI and have more AI replaceable tasks are not showing any employment or hiring growth. The other ones are. So again, we are very much at the early stages of AI, but the evidence is that AI is going down the automation path. And that's quite significant, because I think you would probably agree with me that as a broad technological platform, there's nothing inherent in the nature of AI. And many of the early leaders, luminaries of intelligence, machine intelligence technologies, like Licklider and Engelbart, were very adamant that we could develop machines not to replace humans, but to complement them, to create lots of new activities or make them more productive. Well, that's certainly not the way that I perceive the current effort in AI is working out, and the evidence seems to be in line with that interpretation. So, stepping back, why are we seeing these changes that we have witnessed and I've gone over during the last half hour? I've said already, automation is not new. So if automation is not new, why is it that we are saying these changes? Well, essentially, in a different paper, what Pascual and I do is that we decompose the changes in the overall technology labor share output of the US economy into displacement and reinstatement. So displacement is what I just talked about, what automation does, and reinstatement is the counterbalancing effect. And this is what happened in the US economy. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to get into the details, so you have to, on these ones, it's a little bit more mysterious than what I've shown you before, but we can talk about the details if anybody's curious. So this is the 40 years following World War II. Displacement and reinstatement are in broad balance. And in fact, if you take the sum of the two, this is our measure of the net change in task content is hovering around zero. The same is true in manufacturing. So there's a lot of displacement, there's a lot of automation. But our interpretation is that the reason why you have this shared prosperity and wage growth that's very rapid during that time period, over 2% a year, even faster than productivity in some sectors, is precisely because of this blue. The reinstatement is counterbalancing displacement. And now let's look at the recent period. Displacement is somewhat faster, but reinstatement has become much slower. Especially in manufacturing, there's almost no reinstatement. It's all displacement. Now, I don't find this so surprising. In the same way that mechanization of agriculture was taking place in agriculture, reinstatement came from other sectors. So in some sense, this is the one that's really surprising. There's no reinstatement in the non-manufacturing industry during this period. So this is the basis of my belief that we are in the midst of excessive automation and AI is continuing this trend. So of course you can say this is exactly how it should be. Some have argued throughout the last several decades that technology is always biased against unskilled labor, or perhaps that's what we are seeing. But I don't find these arguments particularly convincing. First, the evidence, as I've shown you, is that there's a lot of room for choice. We can make technologies work in very different ways. In fact, I didn't get into this, but there's a lot of evidence, qualitative evidence, that firms had a lot of choices, sectors had a lot of choices, researchers had a lot of choices in what types of technologies they developed. And the counterbalancing effects were an outcome of that. Second, it's really not true that we are going down a path of super productive AI and automation, and we should take the distributional effects of this on the chin. In fact, the omnibus measure that economists use for the aggregate health of productivity, TFP, total factor productivity, is extremely slow over the decades of rapid automation. So in the 50s, 60s, you had TFP growth annualized over 3%, close to 2%. Today, we hardly make it to 0.5%. This might be mismeasurement, but I think the evidence for mismeasurement is not very strong. We can talk about that. But there is at least a gaping hole in the techno-optimism. We're just not seeing the benefits. Not only we're seeing a lot of costs in the labor market in terms of inequality, we're not seeing the benefits for overall productivity. And in fact, there are plenty of reasons for excessive automation. First, the US government subsidizes automation. We tax labor at much higher rate than capital, which means that we create an artificial wedge encouraging firms to adopt machines instead of labor. And that wedge has gotten much, much larger because of tax changes since 2000. So labor is taxed above 25%. Software and equipment, the two types of capital most involved in automation, are taxed at less than 5%. So we give about a 20% subsidy to firms to automate and get rid of workers. Now, I would also add, and people here in this room are more knowledgeable, but you can disagree, but I think the business models of big tech are a huge contributing factor. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, they are all companies that were conceived as, tech companies doing algorithmically what humans did before. So it's not surprising that Google, has 80,000 or so employees. I don't know the latest number. This might be a little bit out of date, but if you compare other companies that were as large as Google, they had almost an order of magnitude more employees in the past. But it's not only the issue that these companies themselves may not be creating enough work. These companies create the technologies that spread throughout the economy. So it's a pervasive problem if indeed the business models of big tech are biased towards automation. Coupled with excessive zeal for cost cutting, shareholder values, which became all the rage in the 1980s, encouraged many managers to cost cut. So I have some other work on that. I'm not going to get into this, but there's a lot of excessive cost cutting going on, which often made take the form of either laying off workers or even more often automating in order to reduce labor costs. And going back to this choice aspect, the government nature of government support for research, for especially blue sky research, changed. Now, if in fact we have an excessive automation, we have a double whammy for labor. So the only thing that was saving labor was this green productivity effect, which could be small, as I said, but perhaps we can hope that in the future we're going to get a lot more bigger green triangles. Well, if we are having excessive automation, then we are actually automating in this area where we have a negative red triangle. So this negative red triangle takes away from the green triangle. So it's a double whammy. You get the displacement and no productivity gains with the red if you have really excessive automation. So if this is in fact the right diagnosis, then what we need to do is we really need to redirect technological change. This has an element of getting rid of distortions, government support for more blue sky research, which might be quite important for new tasks, but also, technological leaders such as big tech companies will also need to change their focus. Alternative visions and not just cost cutting, but also other sort of priorities in research. Let me give you one example of an alternative model, and then I'll conclude with that. What will AI do to education? My assessment, again, there might be more knowledgeable people in this room, and I'm happy to be corrected, is that the most likely path is that more and more AI technologies will replace teachers. First in grading, which has already started happening, then in homework help, then in teaching. But that's not the only path. 40 years ago, Isaac Asimov said, today what people call learning is forced on you. Everyone is forced to learn the same thing on the same day at the same speed in class, but everyone is different. For some, class goes too fast, for some too slow, for some in the wrong direction. This applies to all teaching and has been a huge burden on especially students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Asimov suggested that we can use technology for individual learning at home. That hasn't worked out very well because Asimov did not know this, but human direction is super important, especially for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So an alternative is AI to augment teachers. For example, to find out in real time which students are having what types of problems so that you don't have the class going too fast, too slow, or the wrong direction for specific students. But problem, because precisely this will require more and more highly skilled and highly paid teachers, demand for cost cutting in education will not make this possible. But I think this problem we can overcome. The even bigger problem is that this is not what most AI researchers will find as the most exciting area. I think it will be much more exciting to reach human parity in things like teaching and homework help in intelligent ways. So I think the bias of AI researcher, which is again embedded in the bias of big tech companies, is towards automation. So my guess, again, I'm an outsider, I may be wrong, is that even if this was economically feasible, AI researchers would need to be pushed into it. They won't go into it naturally. And there are many models of how redirection happens. I took more time than I intended, so let me not get into it, but it was a combination of tax policy, research support, and societal pressure. So I think societal pressure is very important. So again, this will probably be anathema, very annoying to most of you, because most tech people say, well, we know what technology is. We are the experts. We don't want input from people who don't understand, machine learning and all the technical things that we spend our lives on. But I think that's not the right way to think about it. Technologies have huge societal consequences, and it's not right that a group of experts decide what those societal consequences should be. And that's what I mean by societal pressure. So in some sense, tech has to listen to people who don't understand technology as well as they do. All right, conclusion. There are really two phases of automation, especially relevant for AI. Good automation is high productivity automation going hand in hand with new tasks. Bad or so-so automation reduces employment, worsens the distribution of income, and is often associated with excessive automation. It's much worse when it's not counterbalanced by new tasks. And under bad automation, the future of work is dire. And if the future of work is dire, I think democracy is in danger, society is in danger. And I think the preliminary evidence that I have presented suggests that we are going in the direction of excessive automation. So we need to do a course correction. All right, I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to your objections, comments, criticisms.
Well, thank you very much, Daron. This was fascinating. Before I jump in, who has questions? Peter?
Cool. Thank you so much. So first for the talk, I really appreciate it. I had a specific question. You mentioned that the U.S. tax code gives you like a 25 versus 5% tax for labor versus capital costs. And I was just wondering how that compares across other OECD members.
I don't know the answer to that. That's a great question. There are now OECD economists and some other economists working on that exactly based on our paper. That was from a paper I wrote with Andrea Manera and Pasquale Restrepo 2 years ago. And the evidence they think is that there is a similar bias, but not as large. So in the US, that's really a combination of three things that has really become. One is US marginal tax rate on top earners has declined, and capital owners are predominantly among top earners. That's not as true in Europe. Second, we have introduced huge giveaways in the form of accelerated depreciation. That's also true in many European countries. And then third, there are many more S corporations and private corporations, and that's not completely true in Europe, but there's other form of tax evasion in Europe.
Rishi?
Thank you, Professor, for a great talk. My question is about, you presented evidence around how jobs in manufacturing, especially like car manufacturing, declined. And one narrative we hear is that, those people were not retrained in other skill sets or new tasks, if you will. Like, how do you think about sort of education and learning and training people to try to reduce some of the displacement effect or amplify
Right.
the reinstatement effect?
That's a great question. Thank you. So essentially, there are two interpretations of what I presented. For example, showing where Detroit or Lansing City, you're getting hammered. One is that machinists, operators, assembly line workers, welders, they lost their jobs. They should have retrained to become healthcare aides and or accountants, and they just didn't. And that might be their fault. It might be our fault. The second is that unless we simultaneously innovated in those industries, even if they went into it, it would not have helped. Why not? Well, because you're pushing them into tasks in which they don't have a comparative advantage. We already have a lot of workers working in those tasks. So it would not have helped greatly. Now, where is the balance between the two? I think, I would say my own assessment is that 75% it would not have helped even if they retrained, but, they should have retrained and there was not enough retraining. And also, I don't know the limits of what that retraining. I think retraining 20-year-olds is very easy, or at least doable. Retraining 40-year-olds, that's much harder. There's some people who say they have pilots, they've done it successfully, but they're very small scale in general and not always that replicable.
Thank you.
Michael?
Hey, Daron, thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask you like a couple of questions. First, I wanted to ask you about what do you think the role of monopolistic rents are here? Because this is like a perfect competition setup, I think. And the other question is about policy recommendations in terms of redistribution, what is your view on things that has been proposed, like wealth taxes and other forms of redistribution that maybe can shift income from capital to labor?
So I think absolutely, if you want to understand the whole sort of lay of the land for U.S. economy, you have to think about monopoly rents. And for the tech industry, that's not unimportant. But I'm not yet fully convinced that that's such a central part of the labor market changes. So I would say that Google's effects, for example, are much more through the technologies that they create rather than the rents that they create and don't redistribute. After all, how does the monopoly model of the labor market work? Is that because Google is a monopolist, it's holding back its output, and if it increase its output, it would demand more workers. I don't know. I mean, what is it that Google is holding back? I think the classic model doesn't really work very well. Do we really, in the first best, we would have even more digital advertising than we have right now? I mean, is that what Google is holding back? So I'm not completely convinced that's the right way of thinking about it. And in fact, if you look at where labor share declines, most of it is in manufacturing, which is not the sector that has become more monopolistic over time. So in that sense, I'm certainly not saying that Google's monopoly position helps. I think it probably has a role in what type of technologies it creates and in what sectors it goes in and how it liaises with other companies that are doing downstream or upstream innovations. But I don't think it's through the standard monopoly rent channel. In terms of redistribution, I think absolutely U.S. needs a stronger social safety net, but I don't think that that's enough. So one narrative is, automation will happen. Some people will say, like Andrew Yang, in an inevitable way, and we have to do redistribution in order to deal with its consequences. Whether it's inevitable or not, I don't think that is a good remedy. Of course, we need more redistribution, but if we have a society in which, say, 60% of the population don't have meaningful job market opportunity, don't have stable jobs, cannot earn more than the minimum wage, and feel and are understood by the rest of society to be dependent on handouts, that's going to be the end of democracy as far as I'm concerned. So therefore, I don't think that creating more good jobs, especially for non-college workers, is a luxury. It's really an essential element of remaking the society that we have.
So, Devansh?
Thank you for the talk. Super interesting. My question's around something you referenced, which is basically displacement and reinstatement were canceling each other out up till about 2000. And then now there's just not enough reinstatement. What are the measurement problems that you referenced there where, the question I have is, are we not measuring that as well as we are for historical periods because the jobs are new? Yeah. And especially for the AI forward or like the last decade, why is it harder to measure?
Absolutely. That's why I said there's a lot of measurement issues there. I think there are two ways of measuring new tasks. The better way is really just like automation. You go to the micro level and you say, what were the tasks that existed? What combinations of tasks that existed? And that's done for the more recent period. There's a very nice paper by an economist called Jeff Lynn, who did that with some painstaking work. Pasquale and I took that and used it in some of our work, and some of those figures that I showed you with labor share were using his measures. Some of them were using other measures inspired by the sort of things he did. There is now recent work by David Otter and his co-authors trying to go back in history, but it's difficult. If you do that in different periods, it's very non-comparable. And the reason is because, are we going to count jobs? How are we going to count jobs? What's the important skill? What's the new skill? So there's a lot of historical difficulties, So what I did in that figure is a much more indirect way, and to say, where are the places where you're seeing labor share increases above and beyond what you should see? And essentially what this is sort of amounting to say is that there are essentially no industries in which you have labor share increases during this period. Whereas if you go back to the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, there were a lot of industries where you see labor share increases, which is sort of this telltale sign of labor share. It's not perfect, but that's the one way of doing it.
Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to ask you about, I think your characterization of does this button work? Of the people who are AI researchers as basically people who want to build superhuman robots, and of that as the culture of the field is fairly accurate. But I think there's also a strange, like right now people write ML papers about things that seem totally unrelated, and you could sort of imagine that in the way that the natural sciences have taken over ML from computer science, that like education departments will also take these things away from the computer science department. Do you have a sense of, for past waves of automation, what that looks like? Like first there are just people building steam engines, and then, I don't know, there are people who are thinking about agriculture and also building steam engines or something like that.
Yeah, I think, that's a fantastic question. And I don't know the answer to that. I think in the past, many of the most important new tasks came up in a somewhat unplanned way. The people who wanted to electrify US manufacturing didn't say, okay, we have to do that in order to create lots of new tasks. But one implication of that was the creation of a lot of both production and non-production work. So perhaps to say that, AI researchers should be more aware of that might be holding AI researchers up to a higher standard. On the other hand, I think you have seen in the 1960s and 70s in biology and in the 50s in nuclear physics, other sort of currents in which specialized researchers became much more aware, and it was like almost like a phase transition, like aware of social responsibility and took action. So perhaps by those standards, you can say, you might want to hope that something similar would happen to AI in the same way as well. So in some sense, I think part of the reason why this is a good time to have these conversations, I mean, they may be misguided, but it's a good time to have these conversations. I think it may well be that with the increase in the focus on AI and an increase in the diversity of AI researchers, and also some of the social issues that we are witnessing, this might be a phase transition moment as well. That perhaps in the future people will not be as focused on reaching human parity, and there will be other sort of criteria, etc.
Rishi? Oh, we cannot hear you. You're muted right now.
Sorry, I'll skip. I think there's more people in the queue and we're running out of time, so I already had a chance. So I'll let.
Oh, cool. So actually, Daron, we're pretty much at the hour. Do you have a few minutes afterwards?
Sure, I have a few minutes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So then, Peter.
Oh, thanks. So you mentioned that peak TFP growth, like you showed a chart, and it centered around World War II. And I'll admit, I'm not an economist; I'm a physicist. So, like, in my brain, World War II seems like the biggest outlier of the 20th century. And, you have this period before, which, for example, we saw mechanization of agriculture, like just gut agricultural job growth, and essentially what seems like very low reinstatement. World War II happens, and then you're showing the same trend happening again on the other side. So, like, I mean, I can make guesses at like what types of jobs are created by a massive wartime economy, and also the following like rise in prosperity in the U.S. and development of consumer goods. But I could be totally misunderstanding that situation. So I guess
I think you're partly right. For the big TFP actually follows World War II. The decade the decades with the fastest ones were 1950s and the 1960s. But the World War II investments and the social changes that came after World War II may have been very important. And that's the basis of the view of some economists like Tyler Cowen and Robert Gordon, who say we had these great technologies and that's why we had this pretty impressive productivity performance, economic performance, that we've run out of ideas. I don't think that will appeal to people in this room, because they are saying anything that's coming out of Silicon Valley is not a match for the internal combustion engine or the indoor plumbing. We can debate that, but so you're right. Whether World War II itself was important for that, many of these technologies were actually already in prototype in the 1930s. So that's another discussion we could have. The social changes may have been important. Perhaps they would not have spread, suburban shopping malls and all the technologies that came with it. Perhaps would not have spread as rapidly had it not been for World War II. I don't know. That's a hard question.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Ted.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Acemoglu. This is really great.
Thank you.
I really love that you said the kind of this idea, and I know I recently read the newish book by Banerjee and Duflo about, and kind of at the end they end up talking a lot about, I think a similar thread that you said of like, we almost maybe have to move away from like pure efficiency from an economic, like this kind of like pure capital, driven efficiency model, and like look at retraining and look at, because I like that you said also, right, like UBI and like supplements like just won't quite do it in terms of like meaningful work. I guess I'm really curious, like if you have more thoughts on that, of like what does that end up looking like, or even like what could that look like from like a policy and even cultural point of view to move away from, instead of UBI, right? Like what does meaningful work look like in terms of almost like an artificial, perhaps, I don't know.
Right. So I mean, I don't know. I think part of new tasks and new organizations is you don't exactly know what they are. But here is one example, and sort of also reporting evidence hot off the press. What we find, for instance, in new work with a former student of mine who's now a professor at Maryland, Alex He, is that managers who are business school graduates reduce wages and don't share any of the rents that they make, for example, through increases in productivity or increases in demand coming from export with their workers. You know, it's not part of our work, but other people show in other contexts that they also do sometimes big cuts in the workforce and then take big paychecks. So that's a very different model of the business. The efficiency, we don't find any efficiency gains associated with these changes. They have huge distributional changes. So if you have a model of the business firm that is not as focused on cost cutting and wage cutting, that would also start creating more demands for lots more tasks that workers will do, because you have to increase their efficiency via other means. So I think there are different sort of social packages that might be available. We just have to explore them. I think there's a lot of evidence from history that can guide us, but some of that, of course, is the future not quite knowable.
Thank you.
Peter?
I guess I'll just kind of follow up on Ted's question. And I guess it's a bit of a fallacy as an engineer, kind of always like, hey, you're an economist. What's the answer to this? You must know. I don't know. But like, if I'm bounding my world expectations by like the grapes of wrath and the great leap forward in terms of like what can happen to labor markets.
Yeah.
I guess I feel like I keep punting in my mind to like, well, if you have a 20% tax subsidy for capital markets, like what is anybody else going to do?
Yeah.
How do you somehow defeat capitalism without accidentally defeating capitalism?
Right. I think that's a great question. But it's there of the many changes, that's actually the getting rid of the tax bias in favor of capital is the easiest one. If you just let the tax depreciation allowances expire as they were supposed to expire when they were first introduced, that gets rid of half of what I showed you. So politically, we're not doing it, but it's probably the easiest one to do. But it's obviously not enough. But I think the bigger question you're asking here is, perhaps I'm misreading it, but let me end with that, because I think it's the big question. I think when you look at the past, there are two ways of reading it. One way of reading it, which is the one that I offered, is, look, we can do things differently that is both not so bad for productivity, growth, technological change. It might be good, and it's very good for distribution and therefore all the social things that are based on labor markets and sort of shared prosperity, etc. And we learn from the past in order to do better in the future. An alternative is, no, the system is doomed. It was an accident that things worked out for 30 years in the past, and we're never going to be able to repeat it. And then the future is going to look like either like the Great Leap Forward or the Grapes of Wrath, but not going to look like the 1950s. Look, I think there isn't enough evidence to say one versus the other, but I think my reading of history is that there is a lot of evidence of choice that you can recreate things that look much more like the 50s during different periods. So I'll leave it there without a completely satisfactory answer.
No, that's fair. Well, yeah, thank you very much. Let's see.